The sound of crackling flames filled the air as Barron Trump stood among a group of firefighters on the front lines of a massive wildfire in Los Angeles. With smoke billowing around them and the intensity of the fire threatening to engulf everything in its path, Barron didn't hesitate. Without any fanfare or cameras, he pulled on his protective gear and joined the brave men and women risking their lives to save others. But it wasn't just his presence that shocked everyone. It was his decision to dive headfirst into the chaos, showing the world that courage and selflessness don't always need a spotlight. Barron stood at the edge of the fire-ravaged area, watching as the firefighters worked tirelessly to contain the blaze. The thick, acrid smoke filled the air, making it hard to breathe, but it was the sight of destruction that weighed on him the most. Homes, businesses, everything people had worked for, reduced to ashes. It wasn't just the fire that burned, it was the pain of loss, the silent grief of so many families that struck him deeply. For the first time, Barron felt something stir within him that he had never quite felt before, a burning desire to help, to do more than just donate money, more than just watch from afar. In the past, his life had been defined by the glare of public attention, by the roles he had been expected to play. But today, it was different. Barron had been quietly observing the destruction, reading reports, talking to local firefighters, and listening to their stories. But it wasn't enough. The world had been watching him for so long, expecting him to fit into a certain mold. But for the first time, Barron didn't care about that. His family had always been in the spotlight, but this was his chance to step away from it. Barron wasn't just another name. He was a man who could make a difference. As he sat in the back of the fire station, his heart heavy with emotion, Barron felt a call to action. It wasn't just the devastation around him that drove him. It was the faces of the people who had lost everything, their eyes filled with fear and uncertainty, that haunted him. Barron's mind raced as he sat in the fire station, contemplating the decision in front of him. He had donated to relief funds, tried to help from a distance, but it didn't feel like enough. He wasn't just going to be another spectator, watching from the sidelines. His heart pushed him to do something real, something tangible. He thought of the families whose homes had been engulfed by the flames, of the firefighters who had been out on the front lines for days, sacrificing everything to save lives. He stood up, his decision firming up within him. Barron wasn't looking for recognition. He didn't need the spotlight, the cameras, or the praise. What mattered to him now was taking action. He reached out to the fire department, offering his help. It wasn't a grand gesture. He wasn't looking for a stage. He was simply someone who wanted to help, who wanted to step into the chaos and make a difference, no matter how small that difference might seem. The weeks that followed were a blur of intense physical training and mental preparation. Barron learned fire safety protocols, honed his physical endurance, and learned the skills required to help in ways he had never imagined. Every day he trained with the fire crews, not as a celebrity but as a volunteer. There were no special privileges, no easy outs. He was just another person, learning how to protect others, to be a part of something bigger than himself. The emotional moment came when Barron suited up alongside the other firefighters. For the first time, he wasn't just Barron Trump, the son of a former president. He was Barron, a person, standing in the face of danger, ready to fight the fire that had taken so much from so many. The weight of the protective gear, the heat of the flames, and the smell of smoke were overwhelming, but Barron felt something stirring inside him, a sense of purpose. He was no longer living in the shadow of his last name. Today he was fighting alongside these brave men and women, doing his part to help those in need. It was the beginning of something that would change him forever. As Barron stood in the midst of the firefighters, ready to step into the blaze, his heart was full of determination, but it was also full of something else, a quiet humility. He was no longer defined by the life he had been born into. Today, Barron was simply a person, acting from the heart, alongside others who were willing to risk everything to save lives. The transformation was undeniable, and for the first time, Barron felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. As Barron stood with the team of firefighters, the weight of the moment hit him like a wave. The air around them felt thick, suffocating, as the inferno loomed just beyond the ridge. The fire was fierce and relentless, the flames rising high, licking the sky with violent orange tongues. The heat was unbearable, even from a distance, but it wasn't until Barron was standing at the front lines, the fire just yards away, that he truly understood the intensity of what they were up against. The air was thick with smoke, making it hard to breathe. His eyes stung, his throat burned, and the sweat from his brow evaporated instantly in the scorching heat. Every instinct in him screamed to turn back, to find safety in the distance. But as the fire roared in front of him, Barron pushed through the discomfort. This wasn't about his comfort. It was about saving lives, about doing whatever he could to help. The firefighters around him were focused, moving with purpose and precision as they fought the blaze with everything they had. Barron could see the exhaustion etched on their faces, the way their bodies trembled from the heat and the weight of their gear, but none of them faltered. They kept moving, one step at a time, as if every second counted. And in that moment, Barron knew that he couldn't afford to stand on the sidelines any longer. He had to be part of this. The team moved closer to the danger zone, and Barron felt the intense heat pressing down on him like a physical weight. As they navigated through the thick smoke, Barron's vision was limited, the world around him a blur of orange and red. But there was no time to hesitate, no time to be afraid. His eyes scanned the area, searching for anyone who might be in danger, anyone who might need help. And that's when he saw them, a family, running towards him through the smoke. A mother, father, and 2 young children, their faces covered in soot and fear. They were panicked, their every step frantic, as the fire closed in around them. Barron didn't hesitate. He knew what needed to be done. His heart raced as he sprinted toward them, guiding them through the smoke-filled haze. The heat from the fire was so intense that it felt like it might swallow them whole. Barron could hear the crackling of the flames behind him, the sound of destruction, but all he could focus on was the family in front of him, desperate for safety. "Follow me," Barron shouted, his voice firm despite the chaos surrounding them. The family clung to him, trusting him to get them to safety. He didn't think about the dangers. He just moved, step by step, his body pushing through the pain, the fear, the smoke. It felt like an eternity, each second stretching longer than the last. But Barron didn't stop. He couldn't. Finally, they reached the edge of the danger zone, where a fire truck waited to take the family to safety. Barron didn't wait for thanks. As soon as they were in the hands of the emergency responders, he turned back toward the fire. His work wasn't done. His heart still raced from the adrenaline, but he knew he had done something important. He had made a difference, even if just for a moment. The family was safe, and that's all that mattered. The gratitude in their eyes, the way the mother clutched her children tightly, her words of thanks choked by emotion. It all hit Barron harder than the heat of the fire. In that moment, he realized that bravery wasn't about being fearless. It was about stepping into danger when others couldn't, about putting yourself in harm's way, because someone else's life depended on you. Barron's name may have meant little to them, but in that moment, it didn't matter. It was his actions that spoke louder than anything else. And as he turned back to face the flames, Barron felt a sense of purpose settle over him, a quiet courage, one that would stay with him long after the fire was out. As Barron's actions in Los Angeles became more widely known, the shift in public perception was both swift and undeniable. At first, the news outlets were skeptical. Headlines blared with disbelief. Barron Trump joins firefighters. Why would he put himself in harm's way? Critics questioned his motivations, wondering if this was just another stunt for attention, another attempt to capitalize on the spotlight. After all, he was the son of a former president, a member of one of the most high-profile families in the world. Why would someone like Barron, with all the privilege in the world, risk his life in the heat of a raging wildfire? But as the footage of Barron in action began to spread, that narrative slowly began to change. The public's skepticism started to turn to curiosity, and soon, admiration. The cameras that had once caught only glimpses of Barron's involvement now captured moments of quiet courage. Him working side by side with firefighters, pulling hoses, directing evacuees, and helping wherever he was needed. There was no fanfare, no grand speeches, no desire for recognition, just a young man, determined to contribute in any way he could. And it was that sincerity that resonated with people. In interviews with firefighters, the contrast between their initial surprise and their growing respect for Barron was stark. One firefighter, who had worked alongside him on the front lines, spoke with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. "At first, I didn't know what to expect," he said, shaking his head as he recalled the moment Barron had first walked into the station. "I thought maybe he'd last a few hours, then head back to his fancy life. But he stayed with us, day in, day out. He didn't ask for special treatment. He just worked like everyone else, hauling gear, helping with whatever needed to be done. He wasn't here for the cameras, and that's something I'll never forget." Another firefighter, a woman who had led a team into the heart of the blaze, described Barron's quiet strength. He was never the first to speak, never trying to be the center of attention. But when it was time to act, he didn't hesitate. He was always there, pulling people out, guiding them to safety. It's not easy to stand in the face of danger, and he did it without thinking twice. The footage of Barron's brave actions began to make its way around social media, sparking conversations in households across the country. People who had once doubted him, who had questioned his sincerity, began to change their minds. It wasn't just about his famous last name anymore. Barron had proven himself not through words, but through his actions. In every moment on the front lines, he had earned their respect, not as a privileged figure, but as a human being who cared deeply about the lives at stake. The emotional shift wasn't just limited to the public's perception of Barron. It was about something bigger, a renewed sense of community, of solidarity in the face of a crisis. As Barron's involvement became more well-known, others began to step forward too. Volunteers came forward to help with the firefighting efforts. Donations flooded in for the families who had lost everything in the flames. People were inspired by Barron's quiet dedication, his refusal to step back, and his determination to help even in the most dangerous circumstances. For Barron, it wasn't about proving anything to the world. He had quietly stepped into the chaos of the wildfire not for accolades or headlines, but because he genuinely wanted to make a difference. But in doing so, he had inspired a shift, a reminder that true heroism isn't defined by fame, but by the willingness to show up when others need you the most. And that simple, humble act of service became something far greater than Barron could have ever imagined. The heat from the fire was unbearable, and Barron could feel it seeping through his gear, wrapping around him like a suffocating blanket. The wind had shifted suddenly, whipping the flames in their direction, and within moments, the firefighters who had been working tirelessly found themselves in a perilous situation. What had once been a steady line of defense against the fire was now a chaotic scramble. The flames were closing in faster than they had anticipated, a wall of heat and smoke that threatened to trap them. Barron's heart pounded in his chest as he surveyed the situation. The intensity of the fire was unlike anything he had experienced. He had trained, yes, but there was no real way to prepare for this kind of danger. The ferocity, the unpredictability of it all. The roar of the flames drowned out all other sounds. The acrid smoke filled the air, making it hard to see, harder still to breathe. His thoughts raced as he realized that he had only seconds to act. He looked around quickly, assessing the positions of his fellow firefighters, his eyes landing on one who had been separated from the group, trapped behind a thick line of flames. The decision was immediate. Barron could feel every muscle in his body tense as he made a split-second choice. He could lead the group to safety, but there was someone left behind, someone who needed him. Without thinking, Barron turned and ran straight into the blaze, his heart racing, his body screaming in protest. But his mind focused solely on the firefighter who was stranded. He could hear the crackling of the fire growing louder with every step, the ground beneath him uneven as he fought to push through the smoke. His instincts told him to turn back, to prioritize his own safety, but he ignored them. He couldn't leave a teammate behind. The heat from the fire intensified as Barron neared the trapped firefighter. The world around him seemed to blur, the flames an angry blur of red and orange. The firefighter was struggling to get to his feet, the smoke making it impossible to see clearly. Barron reached him, grabbing the man's arm, pulling him up, even as the fire threatened to close in on them. For a moment, Barron felt his body weaken, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The smoke was thick now, choking him, making it difficult to keep his footing. But with one final push, Barron dragged the firefighter away from the flames, his heart in his throat as he realized how close they had come to being trapped themselves. Just as they reached the relative safety of the retreating team, Barron stumbled, the weight of the danger sinking in. He had done it. He had saved a life, but the reality of what had just happened hit him with a brutal force. His lungs burned from the smoke and his legs felt like they might give out beneath him. For a moment, Barron stood there, his hands shaking, his heart racing as he looked at the fiery chaos they were leaving behind. The world seemed to quiet, and in that silence, Barron was hit with a flood of emotions. He had been willing to risk his life, not for recognition, not for praise, but because it was the right thing to do. He wasn't just Barron Trump, the son of a former president. He was a man who had stepped into the fire, both literally and figuratively, because his sense of duty was stronger than any fear he could feel. As the team retreated to a safer distance, Barron felt the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders. The camaraderie of the firefighters around him, their respect, their silent acknowledgement of what had just happened, it filled him with an overwhelming sense of humility. This was no longer about proving anything to anyone. It was about the people he had helped, the lives that had been saved, and the bond he had forged with the men and women he had fought beside. He stood there, his heart still racing, his body drained, but his mind clearer than it had ever been. In the face of unimaginable danger, Barron had made a choice. He had acted selflessly, not because he was expected to, but because he understood for the first time the true meaning of sacrifice. And in that moment, Barron knew that he would carry this experience with him for the rest of his life. The cost of bravery was high, but the reward, the knowledge that he had made a difference, was something far greater than any recognition. The fire was finally under control, but the damage had been done. As Barron stood among the firefighters, the adrenaline that had kept him moving for hours began to fade, replaced by an overwhelming sense of exhaustion. His body ached from the physical toll of the rescue. His mind was clouded with the images of what he had just witnessed. But the one thing that stood out above it all was the quiet peace that washed over him. He had done something that mattered. He had stepped into the flames, not for attention or recognition, but because people needed him. And in that moment, Barron understood what true service meant. The hours spent in the smoke, the heat, the chaos, all came rushing back. The faces of the families he had helped, their gratitude shining through the fear, were etched in his mind. The little girl who had clung to his side, her tiny hand wrapped tightly around his, had looked up at him with trust, with hope. That moment of connection had stayed with Barron long after the fire had been subdued. It was a bond that no words could capture, a silent promise that he would always be there, even if only for a brief moment. Barron had been just another face in the crowd at first, but as the flames flickered behind him, and as he helped carry people to safety, he had become part of something far bigger than himself. He wasn't just the son of a former president. He wasn't a figurehead or a symbol of power. In that moment, he was just a person, working alongside others to do what needed to be done. As the team gathered together to rest, Barron sat on a nearby bench, his back against the cool concrete, his eyes looking out at the destruction. The fire had taken so much from so many, but he knew that in the end, they had saved what mattered most: lives. The weight of that realization hit him hard. He hadn't been able to stop the fire to save every home, but he had done something he could live with. He had made a difference. His phone buzzed, and Barron glanced down at the screen. A message from one of the families he had helped during the chaos. His hands trembled slightly as he read the message, the words simple but filled with emotion. "Thank you for saving us. You were our hero when we needed one most." The message was short, but it was everything. It was a reminder of why he had done this, why he had risked his life to help when no one else could. The gratitude from the families he had helped was overwhelming. The smiles, the tears, the sheer relief in their voices as they realized they were safe. It was those moments that would stay with him, long after the fire was out, and the media had moved on to the next story. Those moments had shaped him, had opened his eyes to the quiet power of compassion. Barron wasn't looking for fame or recognition, but he had found something far more meaningful in the eyes of the people he had helped. He had found a purpose. As Barron stood up to leave the fire station, he felt the weight of everything that had happened settle into his chest. The fire was just one chapter, one moment in time, but the lessons he had learned in those intense hours would stay with him forever. His life, once defined by expectations and assumptions, had shifted in ways he hadn't anticipated. He had become someone who understood the importance of showing up, not just when it was convenient, but when it mattered most. And in that quiet realization, Barron knew that no matter where his journey took him next, he would carry these lessons with him. Lessons in courage, humility, and the simple, profound impact of helping others. The fire had been extinguished for days, but Barron's involvement in the crisis didn't fade with the last flicker of the flames. People began to share his story, his courage, his selflessness, the quiet way he had entered the firestorm, not for recognition, but to help when others needed him most. News outlets, once skeptical, started to change their tune. Barron was no longer just a name in headlines. His quiet heroism was something tangible, something real, and people from all over the country began to take notice. Letters flooded in, messages of gratitude, of admiration. A mother wrote, telling him how his actions had inspired her son, a young boy who had watched the news and now dreamed of becoming a firefighter. "He saw you step into the fire, Barron," she wrote, "and he told me he wants to help people too, just like you." Barron never imagined that a single act of kindness could spark a fire of hope in someone else. He read each message carefully, letting their words sink in. It was more than praise. It was the impact of his actions rippling out in ways he never thought possible. He continued working behind the scenes, quietly dedicating himself to fire relief efforts. He spent hours on the ground with teams helping rebuild homes, providing supplies to those who had lost everything. There were no cameras, no social media posts, Barron wasn't doing this for the accolades or the attention. He was doing it because he felt responsible, because it was what needed to be done. His presence became a quiet comfort to those who were still reeling from the loss. When he showed up to volunteer, the people he helped didn't see him as the son of a former president. They saw him as someone who cared, someone who, in the aftermath of disaster, was there to lift others up. The fire had shown Barron a side of life he had never truly understood before. In those moments of crisis, people came together, neighbors, strangers, volunteers, all willing to put their own safety aside for the greater good. Barron realized that the true power of community lay in this willingness to serve, to sacrifice, and to be present when everything seemed broken. And it wasn't just about the big, heroic acts. It was the small moments, the quiet conversations, the helping hands, the people who showed up even when they had nothing left to give. That made the real difference. As the weeks passed, Barron found himself reflecting on everything he had experienced. He had stepped into a situation where the stakes were high, where every decision carried weight. He had put himself on the front lines, and in doing so, he had discovered the true meaning of bravery. It wasn't about charging into battle or receiving applause. It was about showing up when no one expected you to, about doing the right thing even when there was no reward. Barron understood now that the most powerful acts of heroism were the quiet ones, the ones that didn't make headlines but touched lives in profound ways. People began to see him for who he truly was, not as the son of a political dynasty, but as a man who had found his purpose in helping others. His actions, though simple, became a powerful reminder that heroism doesn't always come with grand gestures. Sometimes it's about stepping into the fire, not for recognition, but because it's the right thing to do. Barron had become a symbol of quiet bravery, and through that he had built a legacy, one not defined by his name or his family, but by his willingness to serve and sacrifice for others. In that quiet humility, Barron Trump had found the true meaning of heroism. Barron stood quietly at the fire station, surrounded by the same firefighters who had worked alongside him in the chaos of the wildfire. The respect in their eyes was something he had never experienced before, and it humbled him deeply. They weren't just thanking him out of obligation. They were acknowledging the bravery, the leadership he had shown when no one was watching. The man who had once been seen as a distant figure, defined by his last name and family history, had evolved into someone they respected for his actions. For the first time, Barron truly understood the depth of what he had done. He walked through the station, his gaze catching the faces of the new recruits. They looked at him with a mixture of awe and gratitude, as though they saw something in him now, a quiet strength that came from selflessness, not from privilege. Barron had come full circle. He wasn't just a name anymore. He was a man who had earned the right to be in their company, someone who had stood shoulder to shoulder with them in the fire and walked out with his heart open and full of purpose. As he spoke to the recruits, offering them words of encouragement, Barron realized that this was where he truly belonged. It wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about making a real impact in people's lives, helping when it mattered most. The fires had taught him more than he could have imagined, and as he walked out of the station that day, Barron knew that the legacy he would leave behind wasn't one of wealth or power. It was one of courage, humility, and the quiet acts of kindness that often go unnoticed. The flames had been extinguished, but Barron's journey had only just begun. If Barron's story moved you, take a moment to reflect on the power of small acts of kindness and bravery. How have you made a difference in someone's life, even in the simplest ways? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your stories. Don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs a little inspiration, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories of selflessness, courage, and hope. Let's continue to spread positivity and change the world, one small action at a time.